The rain came down in sheets that autumn evening, battering the window panes of Westbrook Manor with a violence that matched the storm gathering inside Cassandra's chest as she stood in her father's study, her hands clasped before her with a composure that cost her everything to maintain. The room itself bore witness to their fall, once grand mahogany furniture now scratched and dull from neglect, carpets worn threadbare in patches that no amount of strategic furniture arrangement could hide, and the walls, those damning walls, marked with pale rectangles where paintings had hung before they were sold, one by one, to feed her father's insatiable appetite for cards and dice and ruin. Lord Edmund Westbrook sat behind his desk with the bearing of a man conducting ordinary business rather than selling his eldest daughter like livestock, his face florid from drink, his cravat askew, every inch of him radiating the particular desperation of nobility, stripped of fortune but clinging still to the pretense of authority. "You will be made available at auction 3 days hence," he said, and his voice carried no warmth, no regret, nothing but the flat practicality of a man solving a problem. "Mr. Blackwell holds the majority of my debts and has expressed particular interest in acquiring you. The matter is settled." Cassandra heard the words as if from a great distance, each one landing like a stone in still water, creating ripples that would eventually drown her. She wore a gown of pale blue muslin that had once been lovely but was now faded at the seams, turned twice to hide the wear, its color bleached by too many cleanings and too much time, like everything else in this house, like her own future, worn down to nearly nothing. Behind her, near the cold fireplace, where no fire burned to spare the cost of coal, her mother stood, with her face turned to the window, her silence a betrayal as profound as her father's words, and in the corner, barely visible in the dimming light, her 2 younger sisters clutched each other and wept with the helpless grief of those too young to hide their horror. Margaret, just 17, and Anne, barely 15. They understood what she was being told, what it meant, what would become of her. Asterisk property, asterisk Cassandra thought, and felt something inside her go very still and very cold. Asterisk, I am to become property, a thing to be purchased, to settle debts I did not incur for a life I did not ruin. Asterisk. Terror moved beneath her skin like something living, but she would not let it show, would not give her father the satisfaction of her breaking, would not add her tears to her sisters because someone had to remain standing, someone had to bear this with dignity, even if dignity was all she had left. 3 days. In 3 days she would stand before strangers and be sold to the highest bidder, and there was no rescue coming, no miraculous reprieve, nothing but the inevitable march toward a fate she could not escape, because her family's honor, what remained of it, demanded her sacrifice, and because she had no power, no money, no options in a world that had always measured her worth by her father's name and her potential marriage, and now both were to be traded for his freedom from debt. The night before the auction, Cassandra walked through Westbrook Manor like a ghost, revisiting the scenes of her own life, her footsteps echoing in the empty ballroom where dust motes danced in the moonlight streaming through windows. No one bothered to clean anymore, and she remembered, oh, how she remembered standing in this very room 6 years ago, in a gown of white silk and silver thread, her hair dressed with pearls, her dance card full before the evening even began, when her father's fortune was still intact, and her future stretched before her like a golden road leading to some vague but certainly pleasant destination. That was before the gambling truly took hold, before the night he lost £5,000 on a single hand of cards and came home with eyes that looked already dead, before the servants began disappearing one by one as wages went unpaid, before her mother's jewelry vanished piece by piece into pawn shops, before the horses were sold, and then the carriages, and then the very silver from their table. The descent so gradual at first, and then so terrifyingly swift, that Cassandra barely recognized the moment when they crossed from genteel poverty into true desperation. She caught her reflection in one of the tarnished mirrors lining the ballroom walls, and the young woman staring back at her looked thin and pale, her eyes too large in her face, her hair simply dressed because there was no lady's maid anymore to do it properly, and she thought with a strange, detached clarity. Asterisk. Tomorrow I will become property, a thing to be owned, and I do not even know what that means, what it will require of me, what I will become in the hands of whoever purchases me. Asterisk. The terror she had suppressed in her father's study rose again like bile in her throat, but she pushed it down, forced her breathing to steady, wrapped her arms around herself and made herself imagine the worst so that perhaps reality would be bearable by comparison, though she suspected that imagination had limits and that the true horror of her situation would reveal itself in ways she could not yet foresee. She left the ballroom finally and climbed the stairs to her chamber, where she had laid out her few remaining possessions on the narrow bed: 2 changes of clothes, a book of poetry her sisters had given her last Christmas, a shawl knitted by her grandmother years ago, and the locket, her grandmother's locket, gold and delicate, with a tiny portrait of her grandfather inside, the only thing of value she had managed to hide from her father's creditors, the only treasure she had left. Cassandra picked it up, felt its small weight in her palm, fastened it around her neck where it rested against her heart, and knew that whatever happened tomorrow, whatever she became in the eyes of the world, she would keep this one piece of herself, this one connection to a time when she was loved for who she was and not sold for what she was worth. The private club where such transactions occurred existed in a part of London that genteel society pretended not to know, tucked behind a respectable facade on a street where carriages arrived after dark and departed before dawn, and Cassandra entered it on her father's arm, feeling as though she were descending into some underworld from which there would be no return. The interior, all heavy velvet curtains, the color of dried blood and thick cigar smoke that hung in the air like fog, obscuring the faces of the men, gathered there into a blur of predatory interest and casual cruelty. Her father handed her over to an attendant as though she were a coat to be checked, and she was led to a small room where other women waited, 4 of them, ranging from a girl who could not have been more than 16 to a woman perhaps 40, all wearing the same expression of hollow-eyed desperation, all understanding that they were no longer people but lots to be catalogued and sold. And Cassandra sat among them in silence because there were no words adequate to this degradation, no comfort to be offered when they were all drowning. The auction itself was conducted in a room designed to mimic a gentleman's study, as though the trappings of civilization could disguise the barbarity of what occurred there, and when her name was called, Miss Cassandra Westbrook, daughter of Lord Edmund Westbrook, age 23, accomplished in music and French, excellent deportment, she rose on legs that trembled and climbed the 3 steps to the platform with her head high because she would not, could not, let them see her break, would not give these men the satisfaction of her tears. The crowd assessed her with the detached interest of buyers at a horse fair, noting her posture, her face, the way her simple gown could not quite hide the slenderness of her figure, and she forced herself to look past them, to fix her gaze on the far wall and imagine herself somewhere else, someone else, anywhere but here. The auctioneer began his practiced patter, and the bidding started low, a few desultory offers from men whose faces she could not see, and then a voice cut through the murmur with aggressive confidence. £500. The room shifted, and Cassandra's eyes found the speaker, Mr. Blackwell, her father's primary creditor, a thick-set man with cold eyes and a mouth that curved in what might have been a smile, but looked more like a wound. And she knew with sickening certainty that this was the intended outcome, that her father had promised her to this man in everything but writing, and that Blackwell was bidding not with hope, but with assurance of victory. He raised his own bid twice more, each time with the casual arrogance of a man who believed he had already won, and Cassandra felt the last of her hope drain away as the auctioneer prepared to call the final count, as her future solidified into the nightmare of belonging to a man whose eyes promised nothing but use and cruelty, and she closed her own eyes and felt herself fragment into pieces too small to ever be whole again. As Blackwell's bid seemed certain to win, as the auctioneer's voice began to intone the ritualistic words that would seal her fate, going once, going twice, a disturbance rippled through the back of the room, a sudden shift in the atmosphere, as though a cold wind had blown through those smoke-heavy quarters, and every head turned toward the doorway, where a figure stood silhouetted against the gaslight from the corridor beyond, and Cassandra felt, rather than saw the collective intake of breath, the way the predatory energy in the room transformed instantly into something else, something like wariness, or perhaps even fear. He entered with the unhurried confidence of a man who had never needed to announce himself, his presence alone sufficient to command attention, and Cassandra saw him clearly now tall, perhaps 6 feet and more, with dark hair swept back from a face that might have been handsome had it not been so severe, so stripped of anything approaching warmth, his jaw carved in harsh lines, and his mouth set in an expression that suggested he had forgotten how to smile. And his eyes, dear God, his eyes were the color of storm clouds, heavy with winter rain, cold and assessing, and utterly without mercy, as they swept across the room before settling, with an intensity that made her breath catch, directly upon her. The whispers started immediately, sibilant and urgent. Duke Thorn, Alaric Thorn. I thought he never attended these, and Cassandra understood even through her shock that this man was someone of significance, someone whose reputation preceded him like a shadow, and the fragments she caught, ruthless in business, destroyed the Pembroke Shipping Company, hasn't been seen in society since his sister, lives like a hermit at Thornwood, painted a picture of isolation and perhaps tragedy, of a man who had withdrawn from the world and who had no apparent reason to be standing in this degrading place at this particular moment. Blackwell, recovering from his surprise, raised his bid with aggressive confidence. £1,000, his voice tight with barely suppressed anger at the interruption, and the room waited, every eye now moving between the merchant and the Duke like spectators at a tennis match. And for a long moment, the Duke said nothing, merely continued his steady approach down the center of the room, his gait unhurried, and Cassandra noticed his hands, one gloved, one bare, and marked with an old scar that ran from his wrist toward his fingers, white against his skin. And then he stopped, perhaps 10 feet from the platform, looked once more directly at her, with those winter storm eyes that seemed to see straight through to her fractured soul, and spoke in a voice that was quiet but carried absolute authority, a voice that expected obedience and had likely never been denied. One single word that fell into the stunned silence like a stone into still water. Mine! The room erupted, men shouting questions and protests, the auctioneer stammering something about proper bidding procedure, Blackwell's face flushing dark with fury, but the Duke ignored them all, his gaze never leaving Cassandra's face, and she found herself unable to look away, unable to breathe, unable to comprehend what was happening, except that her fate, which had seemed so horribly certain only moments before, had suddenly become something else entirely, something unknown and terrifying in a completely different way. The Duke named his sum in that same quiet voice that somehow carried to every corner of the room, a figure so staggering that it drew gasps even from men accustomed to vast wealth, £3,000, triple Blackwell's offer, spoken as casually as though he were ordering tea, and the silence that followed was absolute, broken only when Cassandra's father lurched forward with undisguised avarice lighting his features, his voice trembling with greedy eagerness as he declared, "Sold, Your Grace. Sold indeed. The transaction is most agreeable," his hands already reaching as though he might grasp the money from the air itself, and Cassandra felt a wave of revulsion, so profound she swayed where she stood, understanding in that moment that her father would have sold her for far less, that she had never been a daughter to him, but merely an asset to be liquidated when his debts came due. Blackwell's fury was a living thing, his face mottled purple as he surged forward, his voice tight with barely controlled rage as he hissed, "This is irregular, Your Grace, highly irregular." There was an understanding. But the Duke simply turned those winter storm eyes upon him with such cold disdain that Blackwell's words died in his throat, and when the Duke spoke, it was with the absolute certainty of a man who had never been challenged and never would be. "Your understanding is no concern of mine, Blackwell, and if you have complaint with how I choose to spend my funds, I suggest you take it up with your own conscience, presuming you possess one." The threat beneath the polite words was unmistakable, a promise of destruction should Blackwell press further, and the merchant stepped back with murder in his eyes, but silence on his lips, though his gaze when it fell upon Cassandra was full of such venom that she shuddered, knowing instinctively that this humiliation would not be forgotten, that Blackwell was a man who nursed grievances and waited for revenge. Papers were produced, thick legal documents that reduced her entire existence to signatures and witnessed seals, and she watched as though from a great distance, while her father and the Duke bent over the table, while money changed hands in the form of a bank draft, while the auctioneer stammered his congratulations and the other men in the room began to disperse. Their entertainment concluded, and then the Duke was moving toward her, climbing the 3 steps to the platform where she still stood frozen. And he extended his hand, the scarred one, she noticed, not the gloved, with a formality that seemed absurd, given that he had just purchased her like a piece of furniture. "Come," he said, that single word again, but this time it was not a declaration of ownership, but something closer to an invitation. And Cassandra placed her trembling hand in his, because she had no choice, because he owned her now in every legal sense, because Blackwell's eyes were still burning into her back, and anywhere was better than here, and his hand was warm and steady, and surprisingly gentle as it closed around her cold fingers. He led her down from the platform, through the crowd that parted before him like water before a ship's bow, past her father who attempted some mewling gratitude that the Duke ignored entirely, past Blackwell whose hatred followed them like a physical presence, and out into the night where a carriage waited, black and expensive and imposing, with a ducal crest on the door that gleamed in the gaslight, and the Duke handed her up into the interior with the same careful formality before following her in, settling into the seat opposite rather than beside her. And then they were moving, the carriage pulling away from that terrible place, and Cassandra sat in the darkness broken only by the passing street lamps and felt the full weight of what had just occurred crash over her in waves. Her thoughts swirled chaotic and desperate. Who was this man? What would he demand of her? Would he be cruel or merely indifferent? What did he want that was worth £3,000? What had she heard of Duke Thorne? Ruthless, isolated, tragic, dangerous, and she stole glances at him across the dim interior. But his face was turned toward the window, his expression unreadable, his posture rigid with a tension that suggested he too was perhaps not entirely at ease with what he had done, and the silence stretched between them heavy with all the questions, neither asked until the city gave way to countryside, and Cassandra understood they were traveling some distance, that wherever he was taking her was far from London, far from anything she knew, and terror and exhaustion warred within her until she felt she might shatter from the pressure of not knowing, of being property now in truth, of belonging to a stranger whose single word "mine" had changed everything and promised nothing except that her future, whatever it held, would be entirely in his hands. Thornwood revealed itself gradually as the carriage wound through its grounds. First the iron gates with their intricate scrollwork standing open as though expecting them, then the long drive lined with ancient oaks whose bare branches formed a tunnel overhead, their twisted silhouettes stark against the pre-dawn sky, and finally the house itself emerging from the darkness like something from a Gothic romance, all stone and turrets and mullioned windows that caught the first pale light of morning, beautiful in a severe and isolated way that matched its master perfectly, and Cassandra felt her breath catch at the sight of it, this place that was to be her prison or her sanctuary, or perhaps something she had no words for yet. The carriage halted before the main entrance where warm light spilled from the doorway and a figure waited, a woman of perhaps 50 years with a kind face that bore the comfortable lines of someone accustomed to smiling, though her expression now was carefully neutral as she descended the steps, and the Duke handed Cassandra down with that same formal care he had shown throughout their journey, his touch brief and impersonal, before turning to the woman and saying simply, "Mrs. Hartley, this is Miss Westbrook. She is to be made comfortable in the East Wing chambers," and the housekeeper's eyes flickered with something, surprise perhaps, or curiosity, before she curtsied and murmured, "Of course, Your Grace, everything has been prepared." Cassandra followed Mrs. Hartley into the house, her last glimpse of the Duke showing him standing motionless in the drive, his face turned away toward the lightening horizon, a solitary figure who seemed more lonely than imposing in that moment, and then she was inside, where warmth enveloped her, and the beauty of Thornwood's interior struck her with unexpected force. Polished wood and rich carpets and paintings that glowed in the candlelight, everything speaking of wealth and taste and care, nothing like the decaying grandeur of her father's house. And Mrs. Hartley led her up a sweeping staircase and through corridors until they reached a suite of rooms that made Cassandra stop in the doorway, stunned. The chambers were far more luxurious than she had expected, decorated in soft blues and creams, with a 4-poster bed that looked like something from a fairy tale, a writing desk by the window, a dressing room beyond, and a fire already crackling in the hearth. And Mrs. Hartley moved about, lighting more candles while explaining in a gentle voice where things were kept, and then the Duke appeared in the doorway, still formal, still distant, and said without preamble, Rest, Miss Westbrook. We will speak tomorrow about the arrangement." And before Cassandra could form a response, he was gone, his footsteps receding down the corridor, and she was left standing in the middle of this beautiful room, feeling more confused than ever, because nothing about this matched her expectations, not the lack of demands, not the separate chambers, not the careful distance he maintained, as though she were a guest rather than property he had purchased. The first night passed in sleepless disorientation, her body exhausted but her mind racing, unable to reconcile the Duke's coldness with his apparent kindness, unable to understand what he wanted from her if not the obvious things men wanted. And as dawn broke, she rose and began to explore her chambers more thoroughly, running her hands over the fine fabrics and expensive furnishings. And it was then she noticed the portrait hanging in the dressing room. A young woman, perhaps 20, with dark hair and eyes that held a profound sadness, beautiful but haunted, and something about her features seemed familiar in a way Cassandra could not place. When Mrs. Hartley returned with breakfast, Cassandra asked about the portrait, and the housekeeper's expression shifted into something heavy with old grief, as she said softly, "That was Lady Eleanor, the Duke's sister," and the past tense registered like a blow, and Mrs. Hartley continued, "She died 5 years ago, miss, and the Duke has never been the same since." But she would say no more, leaving Cassandra with the weight of that knowledge and the growing certainty that whatever had brought the Duke to that auction house, whatever had made him speak that single word, mine, it had something to do with the sad-eyed woman in the portrait, something to do with tragedy and perhaps with guilt, and Cassandra understood that she had become part of a story that had begun long before she ascended that terrible platform, a story whose ending was not yet written and whose meaning she could not yet comprehend. The breakfast meeting occurred in a dining room that seemed too large for 2 people, its long mahogany table gleaming in the morning light that streamed through tall windows overlooking the grounds, and Cassandra sat at one end while the Duke occupied the other, the distance between them feeling both physical and symbolic, a chasm of uncertainty and unspoken questions, and when he finally spoke after the servants had withdrawn, his voice was measured and formal, each word carefully chosen as though he were delivering a business proposal rather than addressing the woman he had purchased 3 days prior. "Miss Westbrook," he began, not meeting her eyes but instead focusing on the coffee cup he turned between his hands, "I should clarify the nature of your position here so there can be no misunderstanding. You will serve as my hostess for necessary social functions, accompanying me to those events where appearance demands a feminine presence at my side, and in return you will have the freedom of Thornwood and all its resources, your own chambers, your privacy respected absolutely. Nothing more will be required of you." The words should have brought relief, and perhaps they did in some distant corner of her mind, but mostly Cassandra felt her confusion deepen into something approaching bewilderment, because this was not how such arrangements worked, not in any story she had heard or reality she understood, and she found herself speaking before caution could stop her. "I do not understand what you want from me, Your Grace." He looked at her then, really looked at her for the first time since they had left London, and his winter storm eyes held something she could not name, pain, perhaps, or determination, or a weariness that spoke of battles fought long before she entered his life, and his response came quiet but absolute. "I want nothing from you. Miss Westbrook, I merely prevented Blackwell from acquiring you. That is the beginning and end of it." But that answer satisfied nothing, explained nothing, and Cassandra felt frustration rise sharp in her throat as she pressed, "Why?" The single word hung between them, weighted with all her incomprehension, all her need to understand why a duke would spend £3,000 for nothing, why he would bring her to his home, only to maintain this careful distance, why he looked at her sometimes with such profound sadness, and she watched his jaw tighten, watched him retreat behind the cold formality that seemed to be his armor against the world. And when he spoke again, his voice had turned to ice. "My reasons are my own, Miss Westbrook, and need not concern you. Suffice it to say, you are safe here. You will want for nothing material, and you are free to occupy yourself as you wish within the bounds of the estate." He stood then, clearly ending the conversation, and despite her confusion, Cassandra recognized dismissal when she heard it, and she sat frozen as he walked from the room without another word, leaving her alone in that too large dining room with 1,000 questions and not a single answer that made sense. The weeks that followed settled into a pattern so strange she sometimes wondered if she had dreamed it all. They lived separate lives under the same roof, occupying different wings, keeping different hours, meeting only at formal dinners where conversation remained relentlessly impersonal, discussions of weather and estate business, and nothing that touched on anything real, and the Duke maintained his careful distance, as though she were made of something that might shatter at his touch, or perhaps as though he feared what might happen if the space between them ever closed. Cassandra existed in a peculiar limbo, neither servant nor guest, neither prisoner nor free, technically owned but treated with a respect that seemed at odds with her purchased status, and she spent her days wandering Thornwood's beautiful rooms, feeling like a ghost haunting someone else's life, waiting for something to shift, for understanding to dawn, for the Duke to reveal what he truly wanted from this bizarre arrangement. But he remained as distant and impenetrable as winter itself, and she remained as confused as the day he had spoken that single word "mine" and changed everything while explaining nothing at all. Cassandra began to notice things in the subtle way one observes the changing of seasons, small details accumulating into patterns that revealed the man behind the cold formality, and it started with his routines, which she glimpsed from her window or during her tentative explorations of the estate. How the Duke rose before dawn each morning to ride across his lands, a solitary figure on horseback disappearing into the mist, and how he spent long hours in his study, attending to correspondence and ledgers with a diligence that spoke of genuine care for his responsibilities. And then there were the visits to the village, which she learned about from Mrs. Hartley, who mentioned in passing that His Grace had gone to see about the Thompsons' leaking roof or the Wainwrights' sick child, and Cassandra found herself watching more closely, and one afternoon she witnessed from the library window the Duke speaking with an elderly tenant farmer, saw him clap the man's shoulder and press something into his hand that made the farmer's weathered face crumple with gratitude, and later she heard from a maid that the Duke had paid the doctor's bills for the entire village through the winter, without anyone knowing, until the doctor himself had mentioned it, and these glimpses accumulated into a portrait that contradicted everything she had heard about the ruthless Duke Thorn, contradicted the coldness he showed her, suggested depths of kindness he seemed determined to hide from the world, or perhaps from himself. She had taken to exploring Thornwood more boldly as the weeks passed, finding comfort in its library, which proved to be extensive and beautifully maintained, shelves upon shelves of books in the warm room with its leather chairs and perpetually burning fire, and she spent hours there reading, losing herself in stories of other lives and other worlds. And it was there one evening, as autumn deepened toward winter, that she found him, the Duke standing before the poetry section with a slim volume in his scarred hand, so absorbed he did not hear her enter, and she almost retreated, but something made her speak. "I did not expect to find you here, Your Grace." He turned sharply, his usual mask slipping for just a moment to reveal something almost like embarrassment before his features schooled themselves back to neutrality, and he said, "I do occasionally read, Miss Westbrook, despite what society may believe of me," and there was the faintest edge of something defensiveness perhaps, or dry humor in his tone that emboldened her to move closer, to see what volume he held, and she recognized Wordsworth, and without thinking she quoted, "The world is too much with us, late and soon, getting and spending we lay waste our powers," and she watched something shift in his expression, a crack in the winter ice of his eyes as he continued the verse. "Little we see in nature that is ours, we have given our hearts away, a sordid boon," and the words hung between them with unexpected weight, both of them aware they were speaking of something more than poetry, something about the cost of the lives they had been forced to lead, and Cassandra found herself saying quietly, "I thought you cared nothing for sentiment, Your Grace," and his response came after a long pause, his voice lower and more genuine than she had ever heard it. "I thought so too, Miss Westbrook," and he looked at her, then really looked at her as something more than the obligation he had purchased, saw her perhaps as someone who might understand what it meant to armor oneself against feeling, against hope, against the vulnerability that sentiment demanded. And though he said nothing more, and shortly after excused himself and left her alone in the library, Cassandra stood holding the moment close, understanding that something had shifted between them. Some small crack had appeared in the careful distance he maintained, and through that crack she had glimpsed the man he kept hidden, the one who read Wordsworth in the evening and paid poor families' doctor bills and carried a sorrow so profound it had frozen him into isolation, and she realized with a mixture of fear and something dangerously close to anticipation that she wanted to know that man, wanted to understand what had wounded him so deeply, wanted perhaps to reach across the chasm between them, despite knowing how unwise such wanting might be. The summons came on a grey morning when November had settled over Thornwood with its characteristic melancholy, a gilt-edged invitation delivered on a silver tray by Mrs. Hartley, who wore an expression that suggested she understood its significance, and Cassandra read the elegant script announcing the Duchess of Pemberton's annual ball with a sinking sensation in her stomach because she knew what this meant. Her first appearance in society since the auction, her debut as the Duke's purchased companion, and she felt the weight of that ambiguous position settle over her shoulders like a cloak made of whispers and judgment. The Duke informed her at dinner that evening with his usual formality that they would be expected to attend, that the Duchess was an old family friend, and refusal would cause offence, and he added with something that might have been concern, flickering across his features, that he had taken the liberty of arranging for appropriate attire through Mrs. Hartley, and Cassandra felt gratitude and humiliation war within her chest because she owned nothing suitable for such an event, and his awareness of that fact made her feel the poverty of her position, even as his discretion in handling it spared her dignity. The gowns arrived 2 days before the ball, 3 of them in shades of deep blue and silvery grey and burgundy, each more beautiful than anything she had owned even before her father's descent into ruin, and when she tried the blue one and saw herself reflected in the mirror of her chambers, she barely recognized the woman, looking back, elegant, composed, almost duchess-like, and she wondered if fine clothing could mask what she truly was, if silk and jewels could transform transaction into respectability, or if everyone at that ball would see through to the truth of how she had come to stand beside the Duke. The evening of the event arrived with merciless inevitability, and Cassandra descended Thornwood's grand staircase in the blue gown, with her grandmother's locket at her throat, her single piece of authenticity amid all the Duke's purchased finery, and found him waiting in the entrance. Hall dressed in black evening clothes that emphasized his height and the severity of his features, and when he looked up at her, something shifted in his expression, something that made her breath catch before his usual mask descended, and he simply offered his arm and said, "You look well, Miss Westbrook," in a tone that revealed nothing of what that look had meant. The carriage ride to Pemberton House passed in tense silence, punctuated only by the sound of wheels on gravel and the distant calls of night birds, and Cassandra felt her anxiety build with each passing mile, felt herself constructing the armor she would need to face the curious eyes and sharp tongues of society, and she was so absorbed in her own dread that she startled when the Duke spoke quietly. "If at any point you wish to leave, you need only say so. I will not force you to endure more than you can bear." And the unexpected gentleness in his voice made her turn to look at him in the darkness of the carriage, and though she could barely see his features, she sensed his genuine concern, and she found herself saying, "Thank you, Your Grace," with more feeling than she had intended, and his response came soft and almost sad. "You need not thank me for basic decency, Miss Westbrook. You have had too little of it in your life." Pemberton House blazed with light and music, its ballroom filled with the cream of society, elegant women in jewels and silk, distinguished men in evening dress, the air thick with expensive perfume, and the murmur of conversation that seemed to pause and shift when the Duke entered with Cassandra on his arm, and she felt the weight of every eye in the room assess and judge and speculate, felt herself examined and found wanting or curious or scandalous, and she lifted her chin with a pride she did not entirely feel, and tried to ignore how the whispers seemed to follow them like a wake follows a ship. The Duchess of Pemberton greeted them with warmth that seemed genuine toward the Duke and carefully polite toward Cassandra, asking no questions about her presence but making it clear through subtle social cues that she would be accepted here, at least provisionally, and Cassandra felt grateful for that small mercy, even as she remained aware of the less charitable stares from other quarters. And then she saw him across the room, Blackwell, dressed in expensive evening clothes that could not disguise the cruelty in his eyes, and her blood turned to ice because she had not expected to see him here, had not prepared herself for facing the man who had intended to purchase her, and she must have made some sound or movement because the Duke leaned close and asked quietly, "What is wrong?" and when she managed to indicate Blackwell with the slightest gesture, she felt the Duke's entire body go rigid beside her, felt the cold fury emanate from him like winter wind, and his hand covered hers on his arm with a protective pressure that would have been improper in any other context, but in that moment felt like safety itself. Blackwell approached with a smile that did not reach his eyes, offering congratulations on the Duke's acquisition with words that were just proper enough to pass in polite company, but carried an undercurrent of threat and possession that made Cassandra's skin crawl, suggesting that he had not forgotten her, that he still considered the matter of her ownership somehow unsettled, and the Duke's response came cold and absolute. "Miss Westbrook is under my protection, Blackwell, and I protect what is mine. I trust you understand my meaning." And the two men stared at each other with a hostility that made the air between them feel dangerous, and Cassandra understood that whatever civility they maintained was a thin veneer over something far darker, and Blackwell finally withdrew with a mocking bow that promised this was not finished, and she felt the Duke's tension remain even after he had gone, felt his protective stance like a shield around her. The evening progressed with painful slowness through introductions and small talk and the careful navigation of social hierarchy, and Cassandra played her role as best she could, responding to questions with practiced vagueness about her connection to the Duke, enduring the speculation with what grace she could muster, and through it all she felt his presence beside her, solid and protective, occasionally touching her elbow to guide her or leaning close to murmur some observation that made the ordeal slightly more bearable, and she realized with something like wonder that he was trying to make this easier for her, that despite his usual distance, he was present now in a way he had not been before, as though Blackwell's threat had shifted something in him, had made him claim more openly what he had purchased in that auction house. When the music began and couples moved to the floor, the Duke turned to her with formal courtesy and asked if she would honor him with a dance, and Cassandra felt her heart stutter, because this would be different from standing beside him in conversation. This would require touching him, being held by him, moving with him in the intimate choreography of the waltz, and she placed her hand in his and let him lead her onto the floor, and when his arm encircled her waist and they began to move, she felt the shock of proximity. This was the closest she had ever been to him. The first time their bodies had aligned in any way, and she could feel the heat of his hand through the silk of her gown, could see the pale scar across his knuckles, could smell the subtle scent of sandalwood, and something else uniquely him, and she found herself struggling to breathe normally, to maintain the composure expected of her. They danced in silence for several measures, moving together with an ease that surprised her because she had not known what to expect from him, and then he looked down at her with those winter storm eyes and asked quietly beneath the music, "Are you well, Miss Westbrook?" And the question carried weight beyond its simple words, asking not just about this moment, but about all of it, the ball, the scrutiny, Blackwell's presence, the strangeness of their arrangement, and Cassandra found herself answering with more honesty than wisdom, "I don't know what I am, Your Grace." And she saw something flicker in his expression, some recognition or understanding or shared confusion, and his hand tightened slightly on her waist, and he said nothing more, but she felt the connection between them hum with unspoken things, with questions neither dared ask and answers neither knew how to give, and they finished the dance in that charged silence, and when he returned her to the edge of the floor and stepped back to proper distance, Cassandra felt the loss of his proximity like a physical ache, and she understood with a clarity that terrified her that something had changed tonight, that whatever careful distance they had maintained was beginning to erode, and she did not know whether to fear that erosion or pray for it, whether the connection growing between them was salvation or another form of destruction. But as she watched him stand guard beside her for the rest of that endless evening, watched him deflect the curious and warn off the predatory with nothing more than his presence, she knew that indifference was no longer possible, that whatever this strange arrangement had begun as, it was becoming something else entirely, something neither of them had planned and neither knew how to name. The return to Thornwood passed in a silence different from the tension of their outward journey, heavier somehow with the weight of all that had transpired at the ball, and Cassandra felt exhaustion seep into her bones as the carriage rolled through the dark countryside, felt the accumulated strain of maintaining composure under scrutiny and judgment, finally catching up to her. But more than that, she felt something else, building beneath her ribs a pressure that had been mounting for months, the weight of her circumstances, of being sold and purchased and transformed into property, of living in this strange suspended state between captivity and freedom, of not knowing what she was or what she was becoming, and she thought she had mastered it, thought she had built walls strong enough to contain the terror and grief and confusion. But the evening had cracked something in those walls, Blackwell's presence reminding her of what she had escaped and how precarious her position remained, and by the time they arrived at Thornwood and she retreated to her chambers with murmured, "Thanks to the Duke, for his protection," she felt herself trembling with more than fatigue. She dismissed her maid and prepared for bed alone, donning her nightdress with hands that shook, taking down her hair with fingers that fumbled at the pins, and she climbed into the vast bed and extinguished the lamp and lay in darkness, willing sleep to come and grant her oblivion. But instead her mind conjured images. She had tried so hard to suppress the auction house, the platform, the faces of men assessing her like livestock, Blackwell's predatory smile as he bid for ownership of her body and will, her father's cold transaction as he signed papers that transformed his daughter into property, and she felt the panic rise in her chest like floodwater, felt herself drowning in the remembered horror of it, and she must have fallen into some nightmarish half-sleep because suddenly she was back on that platform, back in that room thick with cigar smoke and masculine entitlement, and Blackwell was reaching for her with hands that promised cruelty, and she tried to run but her legs would not move, tried to scream but no sound emerged, and the gavel was falling. Sold, 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 and she woke with an actual scream tearing from her throat, bolt upright in the darkness of her chambers with her heart hammering and tears streaming down her face, and the echo of her own terror ringing in her ears. She heard footsteps in the corridor, rapid and urgent, and then a knock at her door, and the Duke's voice came through the wood edged with concern. "Miss Westbrook, are you well?" And she tried to answer, tried to summon the composure to say she was fine, merely a nightmare, nothing to concern him, but instead what emerged was a sob, and she heard him hesitate on the other side of the door before his voice came again, quieter. "May I enter? I wish only to assure myself you are not in distress," and she knew she should refuse, knew the impropriety of admitting him to her bedchamber in the middle of the night, but she found herself saying "yes, please," in a voice she barely recognized as her own, small and broken and desperately in need of another human presence to anchor her to reality. He entered carrying a lamp, still dressed in his evening clothes, though his cravat was loosened and his hair disheveled as though he had been running his hands through it, and when the light fell across her face and he saw her tears, saw her shaking, something shifted in his expression, the careful distance he always maintained crumbling into genuine alarm, and he set the lamp on the bedside table and stood there, clearly uncertain of what to do, propriety warring with concern, and finally he said, "I heard you scream," I thought. But he did not finish the sentence, and Cassandra felt the last of her carefully constructed walls collapse, felt months of suppressed emotion surge up and overwhelm her, and she began to weep in earnest, great gasping sobs that shook her entire frame, and she heard herself saying things she had never meant to speak aloud. I was property, I stood on a platform like livestock, and men bid for the right to own me, and my father sold me, my own father, and I don't know what I am anymore. I don't know if I'm free or captive, if I'm guest or prisoner, if I'm human or just something you purchased. And the Duke moved then, crossed the space between them and sat on the very edge of her bed at a careful distance, and his voice when he spoke was rougher than she had ever heard it, raw with some emotion she could not name. "You are not property, Miss Westbrook. You were never property. What was done to you was unconscionable, and He stopped, seemed to struggle with himself, and then continued in a voice barely above a whisper. "I attended that auction because I received word it was taking place, because I knew what it was and what would happen to the women sold there, because—" Another pause, longer this time, and when he spoke again she heard old pain threaded through every word. "Because my sister was sold in such a manner years ago, before I had the power or resources to prevent it, sold to settle my father's debts when I was barely 20 and still under his control, and by the time I came into my title and went searching for her it was too late. She had died in misery and degradation before I could find her, before I could save her. and Cassandra felt her own grief momentarily eclipsed by understanding, by the sudden comprehension of why he had been at that auction, why he had bid for her with such absolute authority, why he had brought her here and asked nothing of her, and he continued speaking as though a dam had broken. "I cannot save her, Miss Westbrook. I failed her, and that failure will haunt me until I die. But when I received word of that auction, I thought I could perhaps save someone else, could prevent another young woman from suffering what my sister suffered, could use the wealth and power I gained too late to help her to help another. And so I went, and I saw you standing there with such terrible dignity in your fear, and I thought of Catherine, my sister, and I knew I would not let them have you, any of them, and so I said that word, mine, not because I believed you property, but because it was the only word that system understood, the only way to take you out of that place." And Cassandra stared at him through her tears, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time, understanding at last the man beneath the cold reputation, and she whispered, "You saved me." And he shook his head and said with infinite sadness, "I merely prevented one form of captivity, but I fear I may have created another. You are bound here by obligation and circumstance, if not by physical chains, and that was never my intention. I wanted only to give you safety, to offer you what no one offered, Catherine." And Cassandra felt something shift in her chest, felt the fear that had consumed her begin to transform into something else, something that recognized the gift he had given her even in its imperfect form, and she reached out without thinking and placed her hand over his scarred one and said, "You gave me life, your grace, when I had resigned myself to living death. You gave me dignity when the world would have stripped it from me, and whatever obligation binds me, here I am grateful for it, grateful for you." And they sat there in the lamplight, with her hand on his, and months of careful distance finally, irrevocably breached. And though neither spoke of what this moment meant, both understood that something fundamental had changed between them, that the careful walls they had maintained had crumbled, and what would be built in their place remained to be seen. But for now there was only this shared pain, shared understanding, and the tentative beginning of something neither dared yet name. The morning after their midnight revelation arrived with pale November light filtering through Cassandra's chamber windows, and she woke with the sense that something fundamental had shifted in the architecture of her existence at Thornwood. The careful distance that had defined her relationship with the Duke, now irrevocably altered by shared confessions in lamplight, and when she descended for breakfast, she found him already there, and the tension between them had transformed from the strained formality of strangers to something more complex, an awareness, an acknowledgement of truths spoken that could not be unspoken. And he looked up when she entered, and for a moment neither seemed to know quite what to say, how to navigate this new territory they had entered, until finally he asked with genuine concern if she had managed to sleep after he left her, and she admitted she had, surprisingly well, and thanked him again for his kindness, and he said with quiet intensity that she need never thank him for basic human decency, and their conversation that morning flowed more naturally than any previous exchange, touching on small matters of the estate and the weather and books they had read, but underneath every word ran the current of what they now knew about each other, the pain they had shared, and in the days that followed Cassandra found herself increasingly drawn into the Duke's daily routines, no longer content to occupy her gilded chambers in isolated comfort, and one morning at breakfast she surprised herself by asking if she might assist with some of his estate work, explaining that idleness had begun to weigh on her, that she wished to be useful, and she saw surprise flicker across his features, followed by something that might have been pleasure, and he agreed with a formality that barely concealed his satisfaction, and so began a new pattern of their days. They worked together in his study reviewing tenancy agreements and charitable distributions, and Cassandra discovered that the Duke possessed not only the ruthless business acumen his reputation suggested, but also a deeply analytical intelligence and an unexpected capacity for compassion in his dealings with those who depended on Thornwood, and she watched him reduce the rent for a farmer whose crops had failed, arrange for a doctor to visit an ailing tenant's child without charge, approve funds for repairs to the village school, and she began to understand that his cold reputation was armor over a heart that had been damaged by his inability to save his sister, that his isolation was not cruelty but protection, and as they worked side by side their hands would sometimes brush over documents and ledgers, accidental contact that sent awareness sparking through her, And once when she made an error in her calculations and he pointed it out with gentle amusement rather than criticism, they both laughed, genuine shared laughter, and the sound of it seemed to surprise them both, as though neither had expected to find joy in the other's company. And these small moments accumulated like coins in a purse, building towards something neither acknowledged, but both felt. The library became their evening refuge, both gravitating there after dinner without explicit agreement, settling into chairs near the fire, with books that sometimes went unread as conversation unfolded instead, discussions of literature and philosophy and the state of the world. And Cassandra found herself speaking with an openness she had not known she possessed, sharing opinions she would once have kept carefully hidden, and the Duke listened with attention that made her feel heard in a way she never had been, even before her father's dissent. And sometimes he would share his own thoughts with a vulnerability that she sensed was rare for him, and she treasured these glimpses beneath his armor, these moments when he allowed her to see the man rather than the title. Neither spoke of what was growing between them, the attachment that was becoming harder to ignore with each passing day. The way her heart lifted when she heard his step in the corridor, the way his gaze would linger on her when he thought she was absorbed in reading. The careful distance they maintained even as that distance grew harder to preserve, and Cassandra told herself it was gratitude she felt, natural affection for her protector, nothing more dangerous than that. But she knew she was lying, knew that what she felt had crossed some invisible boundary from gratitude into something far more perilous, and she sensed the same struggle in him, the way he would sometimes start to speak and then stop himself, the way he was careful never to touch her beyond what propriety demanded, as though he feared what might happen if he allowed himself that liberty, and they circled each other in this strange dance of denial and desire, both terrified of naming what was happening, both unable to prevent it. And as autumn deepened toward winter, and the days grew shorter, and the work continued, and the evenings in the library stretched longer, Cassandra understood that whatever this arrangement had begun, as transaction, rescue, obligation, it had become something else entirely, something that frightened her precisely because it felt like hope, like the possibility of genuine connection, and she did not know if she was brave enough to reach for it, did not know if he would allow it even if she tried, but she knew with absolute certainty that she could no longer imagine her life without these moments, without his presence, without the complicated and growing attachment that neither of them would speak of, but both understood was transforming them into something neither had expected to become. Winter arrived at Thornwood with the suddenness of a door slamming shut, the first snow falling in heavy silence overnight, so that Cassandra woke to find the world transformed into white isolation, the estate cut off from the village and neighboring properties by drifts that made the roads impassable. And though Mrs. Hartley assured her this happened most winters, and they were well provisioned to wait out the weather, Cassandra felt the enforced proximity settle over the house like a second blanket of snow, trapping her and the Duke in closer quarters than the careful distance they had maintained could comfortably accommodate, and she found herself intensely aware of his presence in ways she had tried not to acknowledge. The sound of his boots in the corridor, his voice consulting with the steward about the livestock and heating stores, the way he would appear in doorways and pause when he saw her as though surprised by her existence, and the air between them seemed to crackle with all the words neither would speak, all the feelings neither would name. 3 days into the snow's captivity, she stood at the drawing-room window, watching flakes fall in hypnotic patterns, when she heard unusual commotion at the front entrance, raised voices and the stamping of boots, and Mrs. Hartley's tone of concern, and she went to investigate and found the Duke being helped inside by 2 grooms, his greatcoat snow-covered and his face pale, and when she demanded to know what happened, the housekeeper explained. He had insisted on riding out to check on an elderly tenant, despite the weather, and his horse had startled and thrown him, and though the Duke insisted he was perfectly well, Cassandra saw the way he held his left arm stiffly against his body, and the tear in his coat sleeve dark with blood, and before anyone could protest she had ordered him to the library where the light was best, and sent Mrs. Hartley for medical supplies and warm water, brooking no argument with an authority she had not known she possessed. In the library she helped him remove his coat with hands that trembled slightly, revealing the gash on his forearm where he had landed against something sharp, the wound not dangerously deep but requiring attention, and when she had cleaned away the blood with careful, gentle pressure and he sat in stoic silence watching her minister to him. She felt the intimacy of the moment settle around them like a third presence, her fingers on his bare skin as she worked, his steady gaze on her face, the quietness of the snow-muffled house containing them in this bubble of forced proximity. And when she had cleaned the wound and was binding it with practiced movements learned from tending her sister's childhood injuries, he spoke quietly. "Why do you show me such kindness, Miss Westbrook?" And she paused in her work, meeting his eyes directly, seeing in them not the controlled distance he usually maintained, but something more vulnerable, more raw. And she answered with absolute honesty, "Because you have shown me nothing but respect when you owed me none, because you have given me safety and dignity and asked nothing in return, because—" She stopped, aware she was venturing into dangerous territory, but his hand had come up to cover hers where it rested on his bandaged arm, stilling her movements, and his voice was rough when he said, "You owe me nothing, Cassandra," and the use of her given name struck her like a bell, resonating through her entire being, and she whispered, "I know," and the moment stretched between them taut as a wire, his hand warm over hers, his face so close she could see the flecks of darker grey in his storm-colored eyes, and she felt herself leaning toward him as he leaned toward her, drawn by something neither could resist, and his free hand came up to cup her face with infinite gentleness, his thumb brushing her cheekbone, and her eyes fluttered closed in anticipation, but then he pulled away abruptly, standing and putting distance between them, his back to her as he gripped the mantelpiece with his good hand, and his voice when he spoke was strained. "You owe me nothing, Cassandra, not gratitude, not kindness, and certainly not," but he did not finish, and she stood there with her heart hammering and her lips still parted, and her hands still warm from touching him, and she said softly, "I know, Your Grace," deliberately returning to his title, restoring the formal distance he seemed to need, but they both understood that something had shifted irrevocably, that they had come within a breath of crossing a line neither could uncross, and that the careful pretense they had maintained was becoming impossible to sustain. The thaw came a week later, melting the snow into grey slush and reopening the roads, and with that opening came the poison that Blackwell had been spreading during their isolation, whispers that reached Thornwood first through the post, anonymous letters delivered in unmarked envelopes, their contents vicious and explicit, detailing what the writers imagined occurred between the Duke and his purchased woman, speculating on the depravities that must transpire within Thornwood's walls, suggesting that Cassandra was nothing more than an expensive courtesan dressed in respectability's stolen clothes. And Cassandra opened the first letter without thinking and felt the words slash through her like knives, and though she tried to hide it from the Duke, he saw the paper trembling in her hands at breakfast and demanded to know its contents, and when she reluctantly showed him, she watched his face transform into something cold and terrible, a fury so controlled it was more frightening than shouting would have been, and he told her quietly to burn it and forget it. But more letters came, and then Mrs. Hartley reported with distress that the village shopkeepers had heard rumours that tongues were wagging about the Duke's arrangement, and when the Duke made his regular charitable visits, he was met with sidelong glances and barely concealed speculation, where before there had been respect, and Cassandra understood with sinking certainty that Blackwell had orchestrated this campaign of destruction, that his wounded pride and thwarted acquisition had transformed into systematic revenge, and she felt the weight of being the instrument of the Duke's social ruin settle over her like a shroud. She found him in his study 3 days into this siege of rumour, standing at the window with rigid shoulders, and she said quietly that she should leave, that her presence was destroying his reputation, that she had brought nothing but trouble to his house, and he turned on her with such intensity that she stepped back, and his voice was low and fierce when he said, "You will not leave," and she tried to explain that she was ruining him, that the whispers would only grow louder, that his standing in society was being shredded because of her, and he crossed the room in 3 strides and took her shoulders in his hands, not roughly but firmly, and said with absolute conviction, "You will not leave unless you wish it, do you understand me? Not for rumour, not for reputation, not for anything but your own desire." And she looked up into his storm-grey eyes and felt tears she had been holding back begin to fall, and she whispered, "I don't wish it," and watched something break open in his expression, and he said roughly, "Then stay," and the words hung between them heavy, with all the feelings neither would name, and his hands on her shoulders tightened fractionally before he released her and stepped back, and she understood that they had just crossed some invisible line, that her admission of not wanting to leave and his fierce insistence on her staying had been confessions of a kind, acknowledgments of the attachment they had pretended did not exist, and though neither spoke the word love, it roared beneath their careful formality like a river under ice. And when he turned back to the window and said with forced calm that he would handle Blackwell, and she need not concern herself, she wanted to cross the room and touch him, to place her hand on his rigid back and offer comfort, but she did not, because they had already ventured too close to dangerous territory, and instead she said quietly that she trusted him, and left him standing there, and spent the rest of the day in her chambers trying to understand when exactly her gratitude had transformed into something far more consuming, when exactly she had fallen in love with the cold Duke who had bought her freedom and asked nothing in return, and whether he felt even a fraction of what she felt, or whether his fierce protectiveness was merely principle, the determination to shield what he considered his responsibility, and the not knowing was its own particular torment. Blackwell arrived at Thornwood on a cold morning when frost still clung to the windows, arriving without invitation or announcement, his carriage rumbling up the drive with an presumption that made the servants exchange worried glances, and when the Duke was informed of the visitor in his study, Cassandra saw his expression transform into something glacial and terrifying. But he instructed Mrs. Hartley to show the man in and gestured for Cassandra to remain, though she had begun to rise, saying quietly, "Stay, you should hear this." And when Blackwell entered with his merchant's false gentility and calculating eyes that slid over Cassandra with proprietary assessment, she felt her stomach turn with instinctive revulsion, and he wasted no time on pleasantries, but laid a sheaf of legal documents on the Duke's desk with theatrical precision, announcing that the auction had been invalid, that Lord Westbrook had signed a promissory note using his daughter as collateral weeks before the auction occurred, that this prior claim superseded any subsequent transaction, and therefore Miss Westbrook legally belonged to him and must be surrendered immediately, or he would pursue the matter through courts and Parliament and every social channel available, ensuring the Duke's reputation and finances would be destroyed in the process. Cassandra felt the blood drain from her face as Blackwell's words sank in. The nightmare she thought ended returning with renewed horror, the prospect of being handed over to this cruel man who looked at her like merchandise, and she saw her hands begin to tremble in her lap and pressed them together to still them. But the Duke's voice when he spoke was cold as midwinter ice, asking to examine the documents, and Blackwell handed them over with barely concealed triumph, while the Duke read with methodical care, his scarred hand steady on the papers, his expression revealing nothing. And when he finally looked up, his eyes were winter storms, and his voice was quiet in the way that precedes violence when he said, "These claims will be investigated thoroughly, and if there is any legitimacy to them, it will be addressed through proper legal channels. But Miss Westbrook will not be going anywhere with you today or any day, unless a court of law compels it, which I very much doubt will occur." Blackwell's face reddened with anger barely controlled, and he leaned forward with veiled menace, suggesting that the Duke might reconsider given how thoroughly he could destroy a reputation, how whispers about the Duke's unnatural arrangement were already circulating, how a protracted legal battle would expose every detail of their living situation to public scrutiny, and surely the Duke would prefer to avoid such scandal. And Cassandra watched the Duke stand slowly, drawing himself to his full height, and his voice was steel wrapped in silk when he said, "Get out of my house, and if you set foot on my property again I will have you arrested for trespassing, and I suggest you retain excellent legal counsel, because I will be pursuing charges of fraud and blackmail, and I assure you that my resources for such pursuits are considerably more extensive than yours." And Blackwell blustered and threatened, but the Duke simply rang for servants to escort him out, and when the merchant had been removed and his carriage heard retreating down the drive, Cassandra found she could not stop shaking. The terror of being returned to Blackwell's control overwhelming her composure, and the Duke knelt before her chair and took her cold hands in his, and said with fierce conviction, "I will end this. I vow to you he will not touch you. I will burn every penny I possess before I allow him to claim you." And she looked into his storm-grey eyes and saw the absolute determination there and whispered, "This is my fault. I have brought this disaster to your door. and his hands tightened on hers, and he said roughly, "This is not your burden. This is the evil of men who treat human souls as property, and I will not allow it to stand." And he summoned his solicitors that very hour, and the house, filled with legal minds poring over documents and investigating Blackwell's claims, and Cassandra spent the following days in a state of suspended dread, unable to eat, unable to sleep properly, haunted by the possibility that she might be torn from the safety she had found and delivered into the hands of a man whose eyes promised nothing but cruelty. And though the Duke assured her repeatedly that he would resolve this, she could see the strain in his face. The long hours he spent closeted with lawyers, the way he would look at her across the dinner table with something like anguish, and she understood that he was fighting not just a legal battle, but against the possibility of losing her, and that understanding made her heart ache with feelings she still could not name aloud, and she found herself praying to a God she was not sure listened, that somehow this nightmare would end, that somehow she would not have to leave Thornwood, and the man who had shown her the first genuine kindness she had known since her family's fall, and the not knowing was its own particular torture, each day waiting for news, each knock on the door potentially carrying her doom. The lawyers worked through the following week with methodical determination, requesting additional documents from Lord Westbrook, sending inquiries to the courts where Blackwell claimed the promissory note had been registered, consulting with experts in contract law and debt instruments, and during this time Thornwood felt suspended in amber, the normal rhythms of the household continuing, but with an undercurrent of dread that touched everything, and Cassandra found herself withdrawing into silence, spending long hours in her chambers, staring out at the grey March landscape, and contemplating the very real possibility that she would be torn from this place that had become home, from the man who had become infinitely more than her rescuer. And the weight of being the cause of the Duke's troubles pressed on her with suffocating heaviness until she could no longer bear it, and on the 5th day of the lawyer's investigations, she began to pack her few belongings with trembling hands, deciding that she would leave before the matter was resolved, spare the Duke further damage, disappear into some anonymous corner of the country where neither Blackwell nor scandal could follow, and she was folding the gowns he had given her, with tears streaming down her face, when the door opened without warning, and the Duke stood there, his expression transforming from confusion to understanding, to something like anguish, when he saw the open trunk and her tear-stained face, and his voice was rough when he demanded, "You would run?" And she turned to him with desperate determination and said, "I would free you from this disaster I have brought, from the scandal and the legal battles and the ruin of your reputation. All of it is because of me, and I cannot bear it." And she watched his composure, that iron control he maintained so carefully, finally fracture, and he crossed the room in 3 strides and gripped her shoulders and said with intensity that shook them both, "Do you not understand? You are not a disaster, you are—" And he stopped himself, the words dying on his lips, and she looked up into his storm-grey eyes and saw everything he was not saying written there, and she stepped closer, her heart hammering against her ribs, and whispered, "I am what?" And the moment stretched between them taut as a wire, the question hanging in the air demanding an answer he could not give, and she watched him struggle with it, saw the war between his desire and his principle, and finally he turned away from her, releasing her shoulders and putting distance between them, and his voice, when he spoke, was carefully controlled, but she could hear the tremor beneath it when he said, "You are under my protection, that is all, and I will not have you flee like a criminal when you have done nothing wrong." And she stood there with her hands clenched at her sides, understanding that he had retreated behind his walls again, but his voice had betrayed him. That slight tremor had told her what his words would not, and she knew, with certainty that both terrified and exhilarated her, that whatever he felt for her went far beyond duty or principle or the memory of a dead sister. And she knew that he knew she understood, that in that moment when he had stopped himself from speaking the truth, they had both acknowledged what lay between them, even as they continued to pretend it did not exist. And when he asked her in a quieter voice to please unpack, to trust him to resolve this matter, to promise she would not leave without telling him, she nodded mutely and watched him leave the room with rigid shoulders, and she stood there among her half-packed belongings, feeling as though she had just survived something tremendous, and she pressed her hands to her face and allowed herself to acknowledge for the first time in full consciousness that she loved him, that she had fallen completely and irrevocably in love with the cold Duke who had bought her freedom and asked nothing in return, and that he felt something for her too, something he would not name, but that burned in his eyes when he looked at her, and the knowledge was both agony and strange joy. Because even if Blackwell's threat was defeated, even if she remained at Thornwood, the chasm between what they felt and what they could acknowledge seemed unbridgeable, separated by his fierce honor that would not allow him to claim her when she had been purchased, when she might feel obligated, when the power between them was so unequal, and she understood that his very decency was the wall that kept them apart, and she did not know how to breach it. The lawyers arrived at the Duke's study on the 8th day of their investigation with expressions that told the story before they spoke a word, and the senior solicitor, a grey-haired man named Pemberton, who had served the Thorne family for decades, laid out the findings with precise satisfaction, explaining that Blackwell's documents were forgeries, and rather clumsy ones at that the dates on the promissory note did not align with Lord Westbrook's actual whereabouts, according to his club's records, that the signature had been witnessed by a man who had been dead for 2 years at the time of the supposed signing, that the court registration Blackwell claimed was entirely fabricated, and that furthermore, their investigation had uncovered a pattern of such fraudulent schemes by which Blackwell had intimidated and extorted numerous families over the years, and the Duke listened to this recitation with a face like carved stone, and then asked in a voice of deadly calm what recourse they recommended, and Pemberton suggested immediate and very public exposure, a confrontation at Blackwell's own club with witnesses of standing who could attest to the evidence, a complete dismantling of the man's credibility that would end not only this particular threat, but his ability to prey on others, and the Duke agreed without hesitation, and that very afternoon travelled to London with his solicitors and several gentlemen of unimpeachable reputation, and Cassandra was not present for what occurred, but heard the account later from Mrs. Hartley, who heard it from the Duke's valet, how the Duke had entered the club where London's merchant class gathered to conduct business, and called Blackwell out before dozens of witnesses, presenting the evidence of forgery with methodical precision, how Blackwell had blustered and threatened and finally tried to flee, only to find the Duke's men blocking the exits, how the constabulary had been summoned and Blackwell taken into custody, while the assembled men murmured about the audacity of forging legal documents and defrauding the peerage, and by evening it was done, Blackwell's reputation destroyed, his business interests collapsing as creditors and partners distanced themselves, and word came that he had fled London entirely to escape prosecution, disappeared to the continent where the Duke's reach could not follow, but where he could do no further harm to Cassandra or anyone else, and when the Duke returned to Thornwood late that night and came to inform her that the threat had ended, she felt such overwhelming relief that her knees nearly buckled. But the relief was complicated by a new tension, because now nothing prevented the truth between them from being spoken, no external threat to distract from the question that hung in the air whenever they were in the same room, and in the days that followed, they moved around each other with careful avoidance, their conversations polite and surface level, both aware that something must be said, but neither willing to begin it, and Cassandra found herself in a state of suspended anticipation, unable to settle to any task, watching him covertly across the dinner table and seeing the same tension in his shoulders, and finally, on the 4th day after his return, he asked her at breakfast with studied casualness if she would meet him in the library that evening. There was a matter they needed to discuss, and she agreed with a calmness she did not feel, and spent the remainder of the day in an agony of speculation about what he would say, whether he would ask her to leave now that the danger had passed, whether he would maintain the pretense that nothing lay between them, whether she would have the courage to speak her own truth if he did not speak his. And when evening came, and she made her way to the library, her heart was beating so hard she could hear it in her ears, and she paused outside the door to steady herself before entering to face whatever would come next. She entered the library to find him standing before the fire, his posture rigid with tension, and the room glowed with amber light that cast shadows across his features and made the familiar space feel transformed into something both intimate and formal, a stage for whatever scene was about to unfold, and he turned when he heard her enter and gestured to the chair nearest the fire and said with painful formality, "Please, sit," and she did, folding her hands in her lap to keep them from trembling, and he remained standing, one hand gripping the mantelpiece as though he needed its support, and when he finally spoke his voice was carefully controlled, but she could hear the strain beneath it when he said, "I have asked you here because there are arrangements that must be made, matters that should have been settled long ago." And her heart began to sink even as he continued, "I have instructed my solicitors to establish an independent income for you, sufficient to live comfortably, and I have purchased a house in Bath, modest but respectable, where you may reside without any social stigma attached to your situation." And she felt the words like blows, each one landing with brutal clarity, and he went on in that same careful tone, "You are free, Miss Westbrook, completely free of any obligation to me or to this arrangement that was forced upon you, and you may leave whenever you wish." And she sat there, frozen, understanding that he was releasing her, that after everything he was sending her away, and she found her voice, though it emerged as barely more than a whisper, when she asked, "Why?" And he finally looked at her directly, and she saw such pain in his storm-grey eyes that it took her breath away, and he said roughly, "Because I cannot in good conscience keep you here when I feel as I do. It would be unconscionable to bind you to me through obligation or gratitude when the power between us has been so unequal. When you were purchased and brought here with no choice, and I will not be another man who uses you for his own purposes, no matter how I—" And he stopped himself, turning back to the fire, his shoulders taut with tension, and she stood slowly, her legs shaking, and said, "You would send me away?" And he replied without looking at her, "I would give you freedom, the choice I should have offered from the beginning. You must go. Cassandra, you must leave before I—" And again he stopped himself, and she moved closer, her heart hammering with fear and desperate courage, and asked, "Before you what?" And he shook his head, still not turning, and she stepped closer still until she was just behind him and said, "And if I don't want to go?" And she watched his entire body go rigid, and his voice, when it emerged, was hoarse with barely restrained emotion when he said, "Cassandra, please, do not make this harder than it already is." And she reached out and touched his arm and felt him tremble beneath her fingers, and she said with all the courage she possessed, "Tell me what you feel, tell me why you truly want me to leave." And his restraint finally shattered, and he turned to her with anguish written across his features and said, "Because I love you, because I have loved you for months and cannot bear the thought that you remain here from obligation or gratitude, because every moment in your presence is both agony and joy, because I lie awake at night wanting you and hating myself for wanting you when you have been given no real choice, because I must release you even though it will destroy me. Do you understand?" And she felt tears streaming down her face and said, "Then I will tell you what I feel. I will tell you that I love you, that I have loved you and did not know how to say it, that if you send me away, it will be the cruelest thing that has ever been done to me, and I have endured much cruelty." And she watched understanding dawn in his eyes, watched disbelief transform to hope, and he raised one shaking hand to her face and whispered, "You love me?" And she nodded, unable to speak past the tears. And he pulled her into his arms with a sound that was half laugh and half sob, and he kissed her with months of denied longing, and she kissed him back with equal fervor, and the distance that had separated them collapsed in an instant, and when they finally drew apart, he held her face between his hands and looked at her as though she were something miraculous and said, "I love you, and I will spend the rest of my life proving to you that you are free to choose me or not choose me every day, that I want nothing from you that you do not freely give." And she smiled through her tears and said, "Then I choose you, today and every day." And they stood there in the firelight, holding each other while the world realigned itself around this new truth, and everything that had been broken began, finally, to heal. They talked through the night, sitting together on the sofa before the dying fire, sometimes holding hands, and sometimes simply close enough to feel the warmth of each other's presence, and all the words that had been hoarded in silence for months came spilling out in a torrent of confession and explanation. Hopes and fears laid bare between them, and he told her about the years after his sister's death, how he had closed himself off from feeling anything because the guilt had been too enormous to bear, how he had built his reputation for ruthlessness deliberately to keep the world at bay, how the moment he had seen her, standing on that auction platform, something in him had cracked open despite all his defenses, and she told him about the terror of those weeks before the auction, the slow death of hope, the shame of being reduced to property, and how his unexpected respect had confused and then gradually healed something in her she had thought permanently broken, and as dawn began to grey the windows, he took both her hands in his and said with a formality that was nevertheless suffused with emotion, "Cassandra Westbrook, I am asking you now not as the man who purchased you, but as a man who loves you beyond all reason. Will you marry me, truly marry me, of your own free choice?" And she said yes before he had even finished speaking, and they sat together in the growing light, making plans for a future that was theirs to build. And he insisted the wedding should be small, intimate, only people who mattered. And she agreed gratefully, for she had no desire for grand society spectacle. And in the days that followed, there were practical matters to attend to, and he insisted she write to her family to inform them, though she dreaded the task. And when she did, her father responded with a letter so filled with sudden paternal warmth and pride, now that she would be a duchess, that she felt only cold disgust. And when the Duke found her standing in her sitting room with the letter trembling in her hand and tears of anger on her cheeks, he read it over her shoulder, and his face hardened, and he said, "You owe him nothing, not even acknowledgement." And she nodded and threw the letter into the fire and felt lighter for watching it burn. But her sisters wrote separately, tentative letters of congratulation that held genuine warmth beneath the awkwardness, and those she answered with care. And she invited them to the wedding, and they came looking thin and worried in their faded dresses, and the Duke welcomed them with quiet kindness, and afterward arranged for quarterly allowances to be sent to them without their father's knowledge. And Cassandra loved him even more for that unexpected generosity, and the wedding itself took place in Thornwood's small chapel on a clear April morning with only Mrs. Hartley and a few trusted staff and her sisters as witnesses, and Cassandra wore a simple gown of ivory silk that the Duke had commissioned, elegant without ostentation, and when she walked down the aisle and saw him waiting for her with such open love in his storm-grey eyes, she felt that every terrible thing she had endured had been worth it to arrive at this moment, and they spoke their vows with voices steady and sure, promising love and faithfulness and partnership, and when the vicar pronounced them married and the Duke kissed her, it felt like both an ending and a beginning, the closing of one chapter written in pain and the opening of another written in joy. And that night, as they lay together in his chambers, finally and completely united, he whispered against her hair, "You are mine now, truly mine, as I am yours." And she smiled in the darkness and said, "Yes," and meant it with her whole heart, and everything that had been broken in both of them began, finally and fully, to heal. 3 years had passed since that spring wedding in Thornwood's chapel, 3 years that had transformed everything, and Cassandra stood now in the library where so much of their story had unfolded, the afternoon light streaming through windows that gleamed with care, and she rested one hand on the swell of her belly where their first child grew, and looked around at the room that had once been a refuge and was now simply home. And the entire estate had transformed in those years, the Gothic beauty no longer isolating but welcoming, the gardens restored to vibrant life, the tenants prosperous and content. And she and Alaric had built something together that went far beyond their own happiness, for in the first year of their marriage they had established a charity for women in desperate circumstances, women facing the same terrible fate she had faced, and they had quietly purchased the debts of dozens of women who would otherwise have been sold, given them training and positions and the dignity of choice, and Cassandra threw herself into this work with passionate purpose, for she understood in her bones what it meant to be treated as property, and she would spend the rest of her life ensuring that others might be spared that dehumanization, and Alaric supported her completely, his resources and his influence behind every woman they saved, and their marriage had deepened into something she had never imagined possible, not merely love but partnership, passion and tenderness, laughter and shared purpose, and she had learned his body as thoroughly as she had learned his heart, all the scars and stories written in his skin, and he had learned hers, and they had healed each other in ways that went beyond words, and she heard his footsteps in the corridor now, and smiled even before he entered, and when he came through the door and saw her standing there, his entire face softened with the love that he no longer hid, that he spoke freely every day, and he crossed to her and wrapped his arms around her from behind, his hands settling over hers on her belly, and he pressed a kiss to her temple and murmured, "You should be resting," and she laughed and said, "I was thinking," and he said, "Dangerous occupation," with the teasing warmth that still surprised her sometimes, This man who had seemed so cold and remote that first day, and she leaned back against him and said, "I was thinking about that auction house, about standing on that platform believing my life was ending." And she felt him tense slightly and turned in his arms to face him and said, "And I was thinking how strange it is that the worst moment of my life led to the best, how being sold brought me to you." And he looked at her with such intensity and said, "Did you ever imagine we would arrive here, at this happiness?" And she considered the question seriously and said, "No, I had forgotten how to imagine anything beyond survival." And he nodded and said, "I had forgotten how to imagine happiness at all. I had convinced myself I did not deserve it and did not want it." And she touched his face, this face she loved beyond all reason, and said, "And now?" And he smiled, that smile that was hers alone, and said, "Now I cannot imagine anything else. Now every day I wake beside you and think, this cannot be real, this cannot be mine, and yet it is." And she kissed him softly and said, "We are each other's, truly, not through transaction but through choice." And he said, "Every day I choose you." And she said, "Every day I choose you." And they stood there in the library while the afternoon light turned golden, and their child moved beneath her hand, and everything they had built together surrounded them, solid and real, and earned through patience and courage, and the willingness to believe that even the most broken things could heal. 2 summers later, on an evening so perfect it seemed painted by a divine hand, Cassandra stood at the window of the nursery and watched her daughter playing in the garden below, 18 months old now and fearless, tottering after butterflies, while Alaric followed close behind with his hands outstretched to catch her should she fall, and the sound of the child's laughter rose like music through the warm air, and Cassandra rested her hand on the window frame and marveled at the completeness of her joy, at how thoroughly the darkness had been transformed into light, and Thornwood itself seemed to shimmer in the golden hour, the gardens restored to breathtaking beauty, with roses climbing the stone walls and lavender lining the paths, the estate prosperous and humming with life, tenant families thriving, children playing in the village green, and all of it built on the foundation of respect and care that she and Alaric had cultivated together, and their charity had saved 43 women in the past 2 years, 43 women who would not stand on an auction block, who would not be reduced to property, who had been given instead the dignity of choice and the tools to build their own futures. And this work had become the center of Cassandra's purpose, this knowledge that her own suffering had been transmuted into salvation for others. And she heard Alaric's footsteps on the stairs now, and turned as he entered, carrying their daughter, who had grass stains on her little dress and flowers clutched in her fist, and he handed the child to Cassandra, and their daughter immediately reached for her mother's face with sticky fingers, and Alaric stood close and wrapped his arm around both of them and said, "Perfect evening," and Cassandra said, "Perfect life," and he kissed her temple and said, "I never dreamed I deserved this," and she said, "Neither did I, but here we are." And they stood together as the sun set over the gardens and painted everything gold and crimson, and Cassandra thought about that rain-battered manor where her father had sold her, about standing on that platform in the smoke-filled room, believing her life was ending, about the cold terror and the crushing shame, and she thought about the single word that had changed everything, mine, spoken not as possession, but as protection, and how the darkest moment had become the doorway to everything beautiful that followed. And she understood now, in a way she could not have then, that sometimes salvation comes from the most unexpected sources, that love can grow even from transactional soil if tended with respect and patience, that the human heart is more resilient than we know, capable of healing even the deepest wounds, capable of transforming even chains into bridges. And dear listener, if you are in darkness now, if you stand in a moment that feels like ending, know this: transformation remains possible. Grace can arrive from directions you never thought to look, and you are always more than what others would reduce you to, more than the price they place on you, more than the circumstances that bind you. And the word mine can be a prison or a promise, depending entirely on whether it is spoken with love. And may you find, as Cassandra found, that even the most broken places can become gardens, that even the auction block can lead to belonging, that the heart knows its way home even through the darkest passages. And may you rest tonight in the knowledge that you are worthy of respect, worthy of tenderness, worthy of a love that sees you not as property but as precious. And may you discover that sometimes the end of one story is simply the beginning of another, better one. And may you find your own thornwood, your own unexpected grace, your own transformation from darkness into light, and may you know peace.